The frost-covered windshield of the 2018 Honda Civic reflected the harsh reality that had become Nora Campbell's existence. Inside the cramped vehicle that served as her temporary shelter, her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she checked her phone for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The glowing screen displayed a cruel truth. $47.23 remaining in her checking account, 24 years old, and reduced to this. A registered nurse with 5 years of pediatric experience, now homeless and desperate, parked in the shadow of luxury condominiums that mocked her circumstances with their warm, golden windows. Each illuminated apartment represented the life she once had, the stability that had been ripped away 3 months ago when she made the mistake of reporting Dr. Harrison's negligence. The hospital administration had called it insubordination. Nora called it saving children's lives, but her moral stance had cost her everything. The medical community was smaller than people realized, and word traveled fast. No hospital would hire the nurse who had dared to challenge a respected surgeon, even when that surgeon had nearly killed a 6-year-old during what should have been routine surgery. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion these past weeks. The last proper meal had been 4 days ago, courtesy of a soup kitchen downtown. Pride had kept her away since then, but pride wouldn't keep her warm tonight. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius, and the car's heater had given up working 2 days prior. Nora's fingers, stiff from cold, fumbled with the $20 bill she'd found crumpled in her jacket pocket earlier. It represented an impossible choice: gas to keep the engine running for warmth, or food to quiet the gnawing emptiness in her belly. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, enough for maybe 2 hours of intermittent heating. The city never slept, but at this hour it whispered rather than roared. Distant sirens provided the soundtrack to her misery, occasionally joined by the rumble of expensive cars carrying people to destinations she could no longer afford to imagine. Through the cracked side window, she watched a woman in a fur coat step out of a Tesla, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she entered one of the upscale buildings. 3 months ago, Nora had owned heels like that. Not designer, but respectable. She'd had a 1-bedroom apartment with central heating, a fully stocked refrigerator, and the luxury of choosing between restaurants for dinner. That life felt like someone else's story now. A fairy tale she'd heard once, but could no longer quite remember. Her phone buzzed with a notification from her cousin Jessica, the only family member still speaking to her. The message was brief, but loaded with judgment. "Still think you did the right thing? Mom says the offer to clean houses is still open if you're ready to be realistic about your situation." Cleaning houses. Nora closed her eyes, remembering the years of medical school, the exhausting residency, the pride in her parents' eyes when she'd graduated. All of it reduced to scrubbing toilets for minimum wage because she'd dared to speak truth to power. The windows began fogging as her breathing grew more labored with emotion. She used her sleeve to clear a small circle, maintaining her view of the street that had become her temporary world. A police cruiser rolled past slowly, its occupant scanning parked vehicles with practiced eyes. Nora sank lower in her seat, knowing that sleeping in cars was illegal in this district, but having nowhere else to go. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed the toll these weeks had taken. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, and her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp and unwashed. The professional woman who had commanded respect in hospital corridors had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who looked defeated. But defeat was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. Her medical license remained active, and somewhere in this unforgiving city, there had to be an opportunity that didn't require her to compromise the principles that had already cost her everything. The knowledge that filled her head, pediatric emergency procedures, medication protocols, signs of distress that others might miss, had to be worth something to someone. The clock on the dashboard showed past 11:30, and the streets were growing quieter. Soon, she would need to make the choice between warmth and sustenance, between surviving the night and having enough fuel to search for work tomorrow. It was a decision that no one should have to make, but life had stopped caring about fairness the day she'd stood up for what was right. As she counted the bills one more time, hoping mathematics might somehow change the total, Nora had no idea that her principled stand was about to intersect with forces far more dangerous and complex than hospital politics. The night held secrets that would challenge everything she thought she knew about survival, morality, and the price of doing what's right. The decision had been made with numb fingers and an empty stomach. Nora chose warmth over food, using her precious $20 for enough gas to keep the engine running intermittently through the night. The fuel gauge crept slightly upward as she drove slowly through the residential district, searching for a safe place to park where police patrols were less frequent. She found refuge near Meridian Park, an upscale playground surrounded by million-dollar homes that seemed to mock her circumstances with their perfect landscaping and security lights. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a trained pediatric nurse, was seeking shelter beside swings and slides meant for children whose parents never worried about their next meal. The clock on the dashboard showed 7 minutes past midnight when Nora first noticed the small figure huddled beneath the elaborate jungle gym. At first, she assumed it was shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes, but as she adjusted her position in the driver's seat, the reality became undeniable. A child sat alone in the playground, trembling violently in the frigid air. Every instinct screamed at her to drive away. Getting involved with an unattended child at this hour could mean police, questions, and scrutiny she couldn't afford. But as she watched the tiny form rock back and forth in obvious distress, her medical training overrode her survival instincts. Nora stepped out of the Honda, her breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter wind. The cold bit through her thin jacket immediately, making her question how long the child had been exposed to these conditions. As she approached, details became clearer and more disturbing. The little girl appeared to be around 6 years old, with platinum blonde hair that caught the streetlight like spun silk. But it was her clothing that stopped Nora in her tracks. The child wore a pristine white Moncler puffer coat that Nora recognized from window shopping in better times. 800 euros of luxury winter wear. Her tiny feet were encased in boots that probably cost more than Nora's monthly rent used to be. Yet despite the expensive attire, the child was shaking uncontrollably, her lips tinged with the blue-gray of early hypothermia. The contradiction between wealth and abandonment created a puzzle that made Nora's chest tighten with professional concern. "Sweetheart?" Nora called softly, crouching down to the child's eye level. "Are you okay?" The little girl looked up, and Nora immediately recognized the telltale signs she'd learned to identify during her pediatric rotation. The child's eyes didn't track toward the sound of her voice. Instead, they searched Nora's face with the focused intensity of someone who relied heavily on visual cues. Deaf. The realization hit Nora like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories from her volunteer work at the children's hospital. She'd spent countless hours learning American Sign Language after encountering too many frustrated young patients who couldn't communicate their pain or fear. Without hesitation, Nora raised her hands and began signing slowly and clearly. "Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" The child's eyes widened with surprise and relief. Her small hands moved quickly, signing back with the fluency of a native speaker. "I'm lost. I've been here so long and I'm so cold. Papa is going to be very angry." The word papa was signed with a mixture of love and fear that made Nora's heart clench. She'd seen that expression before, in children who lived in complicated family situations, where affection and intimidation intertwined. "How long have you been here?" Nora signed, already calculating the signs of cold exposure she was witnessing. "Since dinner time. I think maybe 4 hours. I was supposed to stay with Mikhail, but I got scared and ran." The child's signing became more erratic as shivers interfered with her motor control. 4 hours in sub-zero temperatures. Nora's medical training kicked into high gear as she assessed the situation. The child was displaying classic symptoms of moderate hypothermia: violent shivering, confusion, and the blue discoloration around her lips that indicated poor circulation. "What's your name?" Nora signed, already reaching out to feel the child's forehead. The skin was ice cold, but not the waxy texture that indicated severe frostbite. "Isabella," came the reply, followed by a surname that Nora's tired brain didn't quite catch in the rapid finger movements. "Isabella, I'm a nurse. You're very cold and we need to warm you up safely. Will you let me help you?" The little girl nodded eagerly, and Nora felt a surge of purpose she hadn't experienced since losing her job. Here was someone who needed her skills, someone whose life might depend on her knowledge and training. As she gently guided Isabella toward her car, Nora noticed other details that deepened the mystery. The child's coat was pristine, but her face showed signs of tears that had frozen on her cheeks. Her boots, while expensive, were the wrong size, too large, as if they belonged to someone else or had been grabbed in haste. "My car has heat," Nora signed, opening the passenger door. "We'll get you warm, and then we'll figure out how to find your papa." Isabella climbed into the Honda with the careful movements of someone fighting exhaustion and cold. As Nora adjusted the heat to its highest setting, she couldn't help but notice how the luxury of the child's clothing contrasted sharply with the worn interior of her borrowed vehicle. The girl's presence transformed the cramped car from a symbol of failure into something resembling sanctuary. As warm air began circulating, Isabella's violent shivering gradually subsided, replaced by the occasional tremor that indicated her body was slowly recovering from the dangerous cold. "Better?" Nora signed, and received a small nod in response. But even as relief flooded through her, questions multiplied in Nora's mind. Who was this expensively dressed child, and how had she ended up alone in a playground in the middle of winter? Why had she run from someone named Mikhail? And most importantly, what kind of family dynamic included both luxury and fear in a 6-year-old's vocabulary? As Isabella's color gradually returned to normal, Nora realized that her simple act of compassion had just entangled her in circumstances far more complex than a homeless night in her car. But looking at the child's grateful eyes, she knew she'd made the only choice her conscience would allow. As warmth gradually returned to Isabella's extremities, Nora's trained eye caught something that sent alarm bells ringing through her medical consciousness. The child's breathing had become increasingly labored, each exhale creating visible puffs of vapor that seemed denser than they should be in the heated car interior. "Isabella, how does your chest feel?" Nora signed, her movements precise despite the cramped quarters of the Honda. The little girl pressed both hands to her sternum, her face scrunching with discomfort. "Heavy, like there's water inside." Nora's heart sank as she recognized the signs. 4 hours of exposure to sub-zero temperatures had taken its toll beyond simple hypothermia. The child was developing pneumonia, her delicate respiratory system compromised by the prolonged cold stress. Without proper intervention, this could quickly become life-threatening. Moving with practiced efficiency despite the confines of the car, Nora began her assessment. She pressed her ear to Isabella's back, listening intently. The telltale crackling sound of fluid in the lungs confirmed her fears. The expensive Montclair coat had protected against frostbite, but it hadn't prevented the insidious damage of prolonged cold exposure to internal organs. "I need you to breathe slowly for me," Nora signed, demonstrating the technique. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Isabella attempted to comply, but each breath seemed to require more effort than the last. Her oxygen-starved tissues were fighting against the inflammation building in her lungs, and her lips were beginning to show the blue tinge that Nora had learned to fear during her pediatric emergency rotations. Drawing upon knowledge gained during her military hospital internship years ago, Nora's mind raced through treatment options available with limited resources. In a fully equipped emergency room, Isabella would receive nebulized medications, supplemental oxygen, and careful monitoring. Here, in a broken-down Honda at past midnight, Nora had to improvise. She remembered the small bottle of eucalyptus oil she kept for her own congestion, tucked forgotten in her jacket pocket since better days. It wasn't ideal, but the antimicrobial and bronchodilating properties might provide enough relief to buy them time. "I'm going to help you breathe easier," Nora signed, retrieving the small vial. "This might smell strong, but it will help." She dampened her scarf with bottled water and added several drops of the eucalyptus oil, creating a makeshift aromatherapy treatment. Holding the fabric near Isabella's face, she watched as the child's breathing gradually became less strained, the natural expectorant properties helping to loosen the congestion building in her small lungs. But it was a temporary measure at best. Isabella needed real medical attention, preferably in a facility equipped to handle pediatric respiratory emergencies. The problem was that Nora had no identification for the child, no insurance information, and no legal guardianship. Any emergency room would involve police reports, child services investigations, and questions that might put Isabella at even greater risk. As if sensing Nora's internal struggle, Isabella looked up with eyes that seemed far too mature for her 6 years. Her small hands moved in deliberate signs. "Papa gets very angry when people ask questions about our family. Mikhail says it's because we're different from other people." The statement sent chills down Nora's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. What kind of family operated under such secrecy that a child learned to fear outside scrutiny? And who was Mikhail, the person Isabella had been running from when she ended up alone in the playground? Different how? Nora signed, though she suspected the answer would only deepen the mystery. Isabella hesitated, her young face showing internal conflict between ingrained caution and desperate need for help. Papa has lots of meetings with scary men, and sometimes people disappear when they make Papa angry. The words hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Nora's hands stilled mid-sign as the implications crashed over her. She wasn't just helping a lost child. She was potentially interfering in something far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Yet as she watched Isabella struggle for each breath, moral clarity cut through her fear. Whatever complicated circumstances surrounded this child, she was still just that. A child who needed medical attention. The oath Nora had taken as a nurse didn't include exceptions for inconvenient family dynamics. Isabella, I noticed something about your watch, Nora signed, gesturing to the elegant timepiece on the child's wrist. She'd observed it earlier, but now recognized the complications of what appeared to be a Patek Philippe, easily worth more than most people's annual salaries. Papa gave it to me for my birthday. He says it's so he can always find me, Isabella replied, touching the watch face with reverence tinged by something that looked suspiciously like resignation. A tracking device. Of course. Nora's medical training hadn't prepared her for this level of complexity, but her instincts told her that time was running out on multiple fronts. Isabella's breathing was becoming more labored despite the eucalyptus treatment, and if the watch contained GPS technology, then whoever was looking for her would eventually trace the signal to this location. Making a decision that would change both their lives forever, Nora reached for her phone. I'm going to help you properly, but first I need to know, are there any medicines you can't take? Any allergies? I'm allergic to amoxicillin, Isabella signed, displaying the kind of medical knowledge that spoke to chronic health issues. And I have something called bronchial dysplasia. It makes breathing hard sometimes. Bronchial dysplasia, a rare condition that explained both Isabella's susceptibility to respiratory infections and the advanced medical awareness evident in her young vocabulary. This child lived with ongoing health challenges that required specialist care and constant vigilance. The pieces began forming a picture that both clarified and complicated everything. Isabella wasn't just any lost child. She was a medically fragile patient, whose current respiratory distress could quickly become critical without proper intervention. The expensive clothing, the valuable watch, the family secrecy, and now the revelation of a rare medical condition painted a portrait of wealth, danger, and vulnerability intertwined in ways that made Nora's simple act of kindness feel like stepping into a minefield. As Isabella's breathing grew more shallow, Nora knew that whatever consequences awaited her decision, there was really only one choice to make. Some situations demanded action regardless of personal risk, and this 6-year-old's life hung in the balance of that choice. The sound that shattered the fragile sanctuary of Nora's Honda was unlike anything she'd experienced in her sheltered medical career. 6 black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon SUVs materialized from the darkness like predatory beasts, their high-performance engines creating a symphony of controlled power that made the playground's silence seem prehistoric by comparison. Isabella's entire body went rigid against the passenger seat, her small hands instinctively moving to cover her ears in a futile gesture against sound she couldn't actually hear. But she felt the vibrations through the car's frame, and her eyes widened with recognition and terror that spoke volumes about her familiarity with such dramatic arrivals. "Papa!" She signed frantically to Nora, her movements sharp with panic. "Papa found me. He's going to be so angry." The choreography of the arrival was militaristic in its precision. Each SUV positioned itself strategically around the playground, creating an inescapable perimeter that spoke to extensive tactical planning. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her simple act of kindness had placed her directly in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than she'd imagined. From the central vehicle emerged a figure that commanded attention without saying a word. Viktor Petrov moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated and purposeful. His charcoal Armani suit, impeccably tailored despite the late hour, probably cost more than Nora's entire medical school tuition. The wool-cashmere blend caught the streetlight with the kind of subtle gleam that only came from fabric worth $8,000. But it wasn't the expensive clothing that made Nora's breath catch in her throat. It was the way every other figure that emerged from the surrounding vehicles deferred to him with the kind of automatic respect that couldn't be bought or faked. These weren't employees. They were soldiers. And this man was their general. Viktor's appearance told a story of controlled violence wrapped in civilized veneer. His dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples that spoke to his 38 years. But his ice-blue eyes held the kind of hardness that aged men beyond their calendar years. A barely visible scar traced along his jawline, evidence of conflicts that hadn't been settled in boardrooms or courthouses. The contrast hit Nora like a physical blow. This man, who could afford to dress his 6-year-old daughter in €800 winter coats and $60,000 watches, had somehow lost track of her for 4 hours in sub-zero weather. The contradiction between wealth and neglect, power and vulnerability, created a cognitive dissonance that left her struggling to process the situation. "Sir," one of the armed men approached Viktor with military bearing, his voice carrying clearly through the still night air. "We've located the tracking signal. The child is in that vehicle." Viktor's gaze settled on Nora's Honda, with the weight of a physical presence. Through the windshield, his eyes met hers, and she felt the full force of attention that had likely terrified grown men into submission. Yet beneath the intimidating exterior, she glimpsed something unexpected. Desperation. This wasn't just a dangerous criminal retrieving stolen property. This was a father who had lost his child, and the relief in his posture was as unmistakable as the authority he wielded over his armed entourage. Viktor approached the car with measured steps, each movement designed to project calm control, despite the obvious urgency of the situation. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the driver's side window, close enough to command, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cultured accent that suggested expensive international education. But underneath it ran currents of barely contained steel. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Slowly. The request was phrased politely, but Nora understood implicitly that it wasn't actually a request. She glanced at Isabella, who was watching her father through the windshield, with a complex mixture of love, fear, and shame that broke Nora's heart. As she opened the car door, the full reality of her situation crystallized. She was homeless, desperate, and completely defenseless against whatever forces she'd stumbled into. Yet Isabella's labored breathing reminded her why none of that mattered right now. "Your daughter has pneumonia," Nora said without preamble, meeting Viktor's intimidating stare directly. "She needs medical attention within the next few hours, or her condition could become life-threatening." Viktor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A sharpening of focus that suggested her medical assessment had his complete attention. "And you are qualified to make such a diagnosis because?" His question carried undertones that suggested wrong answers might have permanent consequences. "I'm a pediatric nurse with 5 years of emergency room experience," Nora replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Your daughter was suffering from severe hypothermia when I found her. The prolonged cold exposure has compromised her respiratory system, and she's showing early signs of bacterial pneumonia." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with Viktor's evaluation of her words and her evaluation of her chances for survival. Around the perimeter, his men maintained their positions with the kind of disciplined patience that spoke to extensive training and absolute loyalty. "You found her," Viktor repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Where exactly was my daughter when you found her?" "Alone in the playground, trembling from cold exposure. She'd been there for approximately 4 hours. Nora paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "She was crying when I approached her." Something flickered across Viktor's features, a crack in the armor that revealed the man beneath the intimidating exterior. For just a moment, he looked like what he actually was, a father who had failed to protect his child. "How were you able to communicate with her?" The question came sharper now, tinged with something that might have been surprise. "I speak American Sign Language. Isabella was able to tell me she was lost and frightened." Viktor studied Nora with renewed interest, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The revelation that she could communicate with his deaf daughter had shifted something in their dynamic, creating a value proposition that transcended the immediate crisis. "You will come with us," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of absolute decision. "Isabella requires medical attention, and you apparently possess skills that are useful." It wasn't quite a kidnapping, and wasn't quite a job offer, but something that existed in the dangerous gray area between the two. Nora understood instinctively that refusing wasn't really an option, but accepting meant entering a world where her old life, her homeless, desperate but morally clear existence, would cease to exist entirely. Looking at Isabella's pale face through the car window, Nora realized that some choices made themselves. The 6-year-old needed help that only she could provide, and whatever consequences awaited that decision would have to be navigated as they arose. "I'll need to bring my medical supplies," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Viktor's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Welcome to a very different kind of life, Miss Campbell. Nora Campbell. Welcome to my world, Miss Campbell. I promise you'll find it educational." The private medical facility that Viktor brought them to existed in a world Nora had never imagined. The building appeared unremarkable from the street, just another upscale office complex in the financial district. But the elevator required a special key card and descended to floors that didn't appear on any public directory. Dr. Petrov's personal physician, an elderly man named Dr. Kozlowski, met them in what could only be described as a medical suite that rivaled any children's hospital Nora had ever worked in. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the medications extensive, and the discretion absolute. "Bronchial dysplasia with secondary bacterial pneumonia," Dr. Kozlowski confirmed after examining Isabella with gentle efficiency. "The child's condition is serious but manageable with proper treatment. However, given her underlying respiratory condition, she'll require specialized care for the next several weeks." Isabella lay on the examination table, looking impossibly small beneath the hospital gown, her platinum hair spread across the pillow like spilled moonlight. The oxygen cannula in her nose and IV line in her tiny arm created a stark contrast to the expensive watch still adorning her wrist. Viktor stood beside the bed with the rigid posture of a man fighting his own helplessness. His earlier commanding presence had given way to something rawer. A father watching his child struggle to breathe, knowing that all his power and wealth couldn't force air into her compromised lungs. "What kind of specialized care?" he asked Dr. Kozlowski, though his eyes remained fixed on Isabella's face. "Round-the-clock monitoring, nebulizer treatments every 4 hours, respiratory therapy twice daily, and someone with pediatric experience to watch for complications." The doctor's voice carried the weight of extensive experience with Isabella's medical needs. Given her deafness and anxiety around strangers, she responds best to caregivers who can communicate with her directly. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Nora understood that she was being evaluated not just as a potential employee, but as the solution to a problem that money alone couldn't solve. "Miss Campbell?" Viktor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Kozlowski tells me that your intervention tonight likely saved Isabella's life. Her respiratory distress could have become critical within hours." Nora nodded, unsure whether she was being thanked or interrogated. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the medical suite, Viktor's scars were more pronounced, and she found herself wondering what kind of life created such careful wariness in a man's eyes. "I'd like to offer you a position," Viktor continued, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to making offers that couldn't be refused. "Isabella requires a full-time pediatric nurse who can communicate with her, understand her medical needs, and provide the level of care she deserves." "What kind of position?" Nora asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Live-in medical care. Salary of $200,000 annually, plus housing, security, and medical coverage." Viktor paused, letting the numbers sink in. "In return, you would be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you would become part of our family's confidential medical team." $200,000. The amount was more money than Nora had ever imagined earning. Certainly more than she'd made in her entire nursing career combined. It represented security, stability, and the kind of financial freedom that could transform her life completely. But it also represented entering a world where children needed constant bodyguards and medical facilities existed in hidden basements. where 6-year-olds wore watches worth more than most people's houses and learned to fear their father's anger before they learned to trust his love. I would need to know more about Isabella's medical history, Nora said carefully. Her care plan, medication protocols, emergency procedures. Dr. Kozlowski will provide you with complete records, Viktor replied. Isabella was born with congenital hearing loss and bronchial dysplasia. She's had pneumonia 4 times in the past 2 years, and each episode has been more severe than the last. The medical reality painted a picture of a vulnerable child living with chronic health challenges that required expertise and vigilance. But it also raised questions about why Isabella had been unsupervised long enough to develop life-threatening hypothermia. Where will I be living? Nora asked, surprising herself with the practical nature of her question. My estate has a fully equipped medical wing with private quarters for Isabella's medical staff. You would have your own apartment, complete privacy when off duty, and access to any resources needed for Isabella's care. Viktor gestured to one of his men, who produced a tablet displaying photographs of what appeared to be a luxury apartment complex. The images showed spacious rooms with expensive furnishings, a kitchen larger than Nora's previous entire apartment, and windows overlooking manicured gardens that belonged in architectural magazines. The position comes with certain expectations, Viktor continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Discretion is paramount. Isabella's medical information, our family's routines, and anything you observe while in our employ remains confidential. Always. The warning was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested the consequences of indiscretion might be permanent. Nora understood that she was being offered entry into a world where information was currency and trust was literally a matter of life and death. As if sensing the weight of the decision before her, Isabella stirred on the examination table. Her small hands moved in sleepy sign language, asking for water and expressing concern about making her papa angry. Watching the child struggle with each breath, Nora felt her moral compass align with crystal clarity. Whatever complicated ethics surrounded Viktor's life, Isabella was an innocent 6-year-old who needed medical care that Nora was uniquely qualified to provide. I'll need a written care plan from Dr. Kozlowski, access to Isabella's complete medical records, and emergency protocols for respiratory distress, Nora said, her voice steady with decision. Viktor's smile was sharp, but not unkind. You'll find that working for me provides resources you've never had access to. The best medical equipment, unlimited pharmaceutical supplies, and the kind of job security that doesn't depend on hospital politics or administrative decisions. The reference to her previous job loss wasn't subtle, but it reminded Nora of how quickly her principled stand had cost her everything she'd worked for. Here was an opportunity to use her skills in service of someone who genuinely needed them, with compensation that would ensure she never faced homelessness again. When would I start? She asked. Tonight. Isabella's condition requires immediate stabilization, and Dr. Kozlowski recommends continuous monitoring for the next 72 hours. Viktor's expression softened slightly as he looked at his daughter. She trusts you already, which is more than I can say for most people who enter our lives. As Nora accepted the position that would transform her from homeless nurse to confidential medical staff for one of the city's most dangerous families, she understood that she was crossing a line from which there might be no return. But looking at Isabella's face, peaceful now with proper medical treatment, she knew that some decisions transcended personal safety. The world she was entering might be complicated and dangerous, but it was also one where her skills mattered, where she could make a real difference in a child's life, and where the principles that had cost her everything might finally find their proper value. 3 weeks had passed since Nora began caring for Isabella in the medical wing of Viktor's estate, and she'd settled into a routine that felt almost normal despite the armed guards patrolling the grounds and the encrypted communications that buzzed through the house at all hours. Isabella's pneumonia had responded well to treatment under Nora's vigilant care. The child's breathing had strengthened, her energy had returned, and their bond had deepened through shared sign language conversations that created an island of normalcy in their extraordinary circumstances. The luxury of their accommodations still left Nora speechless at times. Her private apartment boasted marble countertops, a bedroom larger than her previous entire living space, and a view of gardens that belonged in European estates. Isabella's medical suite rivaled any children's hospital, equipped with state-of-the-art monitoring systems and pharmaceutical supplies that would have cost millions in a traditional healthcare setting. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. When Isabella would curl up beside Nora during nebulizer treatments, signing stories about imaginary adventures where little girls could hear birdsong and their fathers weren't afraid of showing affection in public. The illusion of security shattered at exactly 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. Nora was reviewing Isabella's medication schedule when Viktor burst into the medical wing with the kind of controlled urgency that made her blood freeze. Behind him came Mikhail, the head of security, whose massive frame and scarred hands spoke to a history of violence barely contained beneath expensive suits. "Pack Isabella's emergency medical kit." "Now!" Viktor commanded, his ice-blue eyes scanning the room with military precision. "We're relocating within 10 minutes. "What's happening?" Nora signed to Isabella, who had gone rigid with fear at her father's tone. "Bad men are coming," Isabella replied, her small hands trembling as she formed the words. "Papa's enemies want to hurt him by taking me away. The Kozlov family." Nora had overheard enough whispered conversations between Viktor's men to understand the basic dynamics at play. Rival organization, territorial disputes, and the kind of blood feuds that turn children into weapons and leverage. But understanding the politics didn't prepare her for the reality of Isabella being targeted by people who viewed a 6-year-old as collateral damage in their war against her father. "Where are we going?" Nora asked Viktor, efficiently packing Isabella's essential medications and emergency supplies. "Safe house across town." "The Kozlovs have been watching our routines, mapping our security protocols. They know about Isabella's medical needs, which makes her more vulnerable during transport." The admission hit Nora like a physical blow. These people had been studying Isabella's health conditions, learning her weaknesses, planning to exploit a child's medical fragility for maximum psychological impact against Viktor. As they moved through the estate toward the armored vehicles waiting in the circular drive, Nora caught glimpses of preparation that spoke to military-level coordination. Men in tactical gear positioned at strategic points, communication equipment crackling with coded updates, and weapons that belonged in war zones rather than residential neighborhoods. Isabella clung to Nora's hand with the desperate grip of someone who understood that her life had just become infinitely more dangerous. The child's breathing showed signs of stress-induced constriction, and Nora made mental notes about medication adjustments that might be needed if the situation escalated further. The convoy consisted of 6 identical black SUVs, making it impossible for observers to determine which vehicle contained the actual targets. Nora and Isabella were placed in the third vehicle, surrounded by armed guards whose eyes never stopped scanning for threats that might materialize from any direction. 20 minutes into the journey, those threats became reality. The attack came with the precision of professionals who had studied their targets extensively. 2 vehicles blocked the intersection ahead, while others emerged from side streets, creating a tactical box that trapped the convoy in a kill zone designed for maximum effectiveness. Gunfire erupted with the sharp crack of military-grade weapons, shattering windows and puncturing armor in controlled bursts that spoke to extensive training and superior equipment. Viktor's men responded with their own coordinated fire, but Nora could see immediately that they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Isabella's respiratory distress spiked with terror, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid in a way that triggered every emergency protocol Nora had memorized. The child was experiencing an acute asthma attack brought on by stress, and without immediate intervention, her compromised airways could close completely. "I need to get to her inhaler," Nora shouted to the guards over the sound of automatic weapons fire. "Stay down," one of them replied, returning fire through the shattered rear window. "Medical kit is in the front compartment." The front compartment was 6 feet away through a battlefield where bullets were shattering glass and puncturing metal with lethal precision. But Isabella's lips were turning blue with oxygen deprivation, and her panic was making the airway constriction worse with each passing second. Without allowing herself time to consider the consequences, Nora launched herself toward the medical kit as gunfire exploded around her. Her training from the military hospital internship years ago kicked in with muscle memory she hadn't accessed since medical school. How to move under fire, how to prioritize life-saving intervention over personal safety, how to function when everything depended on keeping calm under impossible pressure. She reached the albuterol inhaler just as a bullet shattered the window above her head. showering her with glass fragments that drew blood from her scalp and shoulders. But Isabella's breathing took priority over her own injuries, and she fought her way back to the child's side with single-minded determination. "Breathe with me," she signed to Isabella, while administering the bronchodilator. "Slow and steady, you're safe." It was a lie. They were anything but safe. But Isabella needed calm reassurance more than accurate threat assessment. The medication began working immediately, opening her airways and allowing oxygen to reach her starved tissues. As Isabella's breathing stabilized, Nora became aware that the gunfire had ceased. Through the destroyed windows, she could see Viktor standing over the bodies of their attackers, with the kind of cold satisfaction that spoke to personal vendettances finally satisfied. But the victory felt hollow when she realized how close they'd come to losing Isabella to a medical emergency triggered by violence. The child's health condition made her extraordinarily vulnerable in situations like this, and the stress alone could have killed her without proper intervention. Viktor appeared at the vehicle's open door, his suit torn and blood-stained, but his eyes focused entirely on his daughter. "Is she injured?" "Acute asthma attack. But it's under control now," Nora reported, automatically falling into medical professional mode. "She needs to be monitored for the next few hours in case of secondary complications." Viktor's gaze shifted to Nora's bleeding face and shoulders, registering her injuries with something that looked suspiciously like concern. "You were hurt protecting her." "It's minor compared to what could have happened to Isabella," Nora replied, meaning it completely. Something shifted in Viktor's expression as he studied her. A recognition that went deeper than professional competence or financial transaction. She'd risked her life without hesitation to save his daughter, crossing a line from employee to something approaching family in the space of a single emergency. The realization carried weight that Nora couldn't fully process yet, but she understood instinctively that their relationship had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just Isabella's nurse. She was someone Viktor trusted with the most precious thing in his dangerous world. The aftermath of the Kozlov ambush brought changes that rippled through every aspect of Viktor's organization. 3 days after the attack, Nora found herself in the master suite of the estate, tending to wounds that Viktor had refused to let anyone else treat. Not Dr. Kozlowski, not his personal security team, not even the military medics who handled such situations for his organization. "The bullet fragments need to come out," Nora said, examining the shoulder wound that Viktor had been ignoring despite obvious signs of infection. "This isn't something you can just tough through." Viktor sat shirtless on the edge of his bed, his muscled torso telling stories of violence survived and battles fought. Scars crisscrossed his chest and back like a roadmap of his dangerous life, each mark representing conflicts that most people couldn't imagine surviving. But it was the fresh wound that concerned Nora, torn flesh around embedded metal that spoke to how close he'd come to losing everything while protecting his daughter. "I've had worse," Viktor replied, with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested he genuinely believed minor surgery was optional. "Isabella has been asking why you won't let her see you," Nora said, preparing local anesthetic despite his protests. "She thinks you're angry with her for causing the attack." Something flickered across Viktor's features. Pain that had nothing to do with physical injuries. The realization that his daughter blamed herself for adult conflicts hit him with force, that made him flinch more than the antiseptic touching raw flesh. "She shouldn't have been exposed to any of this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of regret that Nora hadn't heard before. "When her mother died, I promised I would protect her from my world. Instead, I've made her a target." The admission surprised Nora with its raw honesty. Viktor rarely spoke about personal matters, maintaining the kind of emotional distance that protected both his position and his vulnerabilities. But physical pain and emotional exhaustion seemed to have stripped away some of his usual defenses. "Isabella doesn't need protection from your world," Nora said, beginning the delicate process of extracting bullet fragments with steady hands. "She needs to understand her place in it. Right now, she's terrified that loving you makes her dangerous to you." Viktor's jaw tightened as surgical forceps probed damaged tissue, but his reaction seemed more about Nora's words than the physical intervention. "Loving me does make her dangerous, and loving her makes me weak in ways that could destroy everything I've built, or it could make you stronger in ways you haven't considered," Nora replied, dropping the first metal fragment into a steel bowl with a distinctive ping. Isabella watched you eliminate an entire team of professional killers to protect her. She doesn't see weakness. She sees a father who would burn the world down to keep her safe. The conversation was interrupted by soft knocking on the door, the kind of tentative sound that could only come from someone very small, trying not to disturb important adult business. Through the heavy oak came the whispered voice of Isabella, calling for her papa in the Russian, that she reserved for moments of deep emotional need. Viktor's entire demeanor transformed at the sound. The dangerous crime boss dissolved, replaced by a father whose heart broke at hearing his child's distress. "She's supposed to be sleeping. She's been having nightmares since the attack," Nora explained, working to remove the second bullet fragment while Viktor's attention remained focused on the door. "Medical trauma, combined with seeing violence, plus worry about your condition. Her respiratory issues get worse when she's emotionally stressed." Without waiting for permission, Viktor called out in gentle Russian, inviting Isabella to enter. The 6-year-old appeared in the doorway wearing purple pajamas and carrying the stuffed bear that had become her security object since the attack. Her platinum hair was tousled from fitful sleep, and her eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that came from too much worry for someone so young. Isabella's gaze immediately fixed on her father's bandaged shoulder, and her small hands began moving in rapid sign language that mixed languages in the way children do when emotions overwhelm vocabulary. "She's asking if you're going to die like Mama," Nora translated, her voice gentle as she continued the medical procedure. "And she wants to know if it's her fault that bad men tried to hurt you." Viktor's response came in fluid ASL, his hands moving with surprising grace for someone with his injured shoulder. Isabella's face brightened slightly as he assured her that his injuries were minor and that protecting her was the most important job in his life. But it was what happened next that changed everything between the three of them. Isabella climbed carefully onto the bed beside her father, positioning herself so she could watch Nora work while maintaining physical contact with Viktor. Her small hand rested on his uninjured arm, and she began signing questions about medical procedures, with the kind of scientific curiosity that reminded Nora why she'd become a pediatric nurse in the first place. "She wants to know if helping you feel better makes her useful instead of just dangerous," Nora interpreted, touched by the child's attempt to find positive purpose in traumatic circumstances. Viktor's response was longer and more emotional than his usual communications. He explained that Isabella's existence gave his life meaning beyond power or wealth, that protecting her taught him what truly mattered, and that her love made him want to be better than the violent man circumstances had shaped him to become. As Nora finished removing the final bullet fragment and began suturing the wound, she found herself part of a family moment that felt both intimate and profound. Isabella had fallen asleep against her father's side, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since the attack. Viktor's hand rested protectively on his daughter's head, and his eyes held a tenderness that completely transformed his usually intimidating features. "She trusts you completely," Viktor said quietly, his voice careful not to wake Isabella. "In 3 weeks, you've become more important to her than people who've been in our lives for years." "She needed someone who could understand her world without judging it," Nora replied, applying the final suture with practiced precision. "Someone who saw her as a child first, and a crime boss's daughter second." Viktor studied Nora with the kind of intense focus she'd learned meant he was making decisions that would affect all their lives. "And what do you see when you look at me?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond medical care or employment contracts. Nora understood that her answer would determine whether she remained simply Isabella's nurse or became something more integral to their complicated family dynamic. "I see a man who would die to protect his daughter, even though he's terrified that loving her makes them both vulnerable," she said honestly. "I see someone who built walls around his heart, but tears them down every time Isabella needs him. And I see a father who deserves to believe that love makes him stronger, not weaker." Viktor's smile was soft and genuine, completely unlike the predatory expression she'd witnessed during business meetings or security briefings. "Isabella isn't the only one who trusts you completely." The admission carried weight that made Nora's chest tighten with recognition of how fundamentally her life had changed. She'd entered Viktor's world as a desperate woman with nothing to lose, but somewhere along the way she'd become someone with everything to protect. As she gathered her medical supplies and prepared to let father and daughter rest, Viktor's voice stopped her at the door. "Nora, When I said this position came with certain expectations, I never imagined the most important one would be teaching me how to be the father Isabella deserves. Standing in the doorway watching them sleep, the dangerous crime boss and his fragile daughter finding peace in each other's presence. Nora understood that she'd found something worth far more than financial security. She'd found family, complicated and dangerous, and perfect in ways she'd never expected. 6 months after the Kozlov attack, Nora stood at the window of her medical office, watching Isabella play in the snow-covered gardens of the estate. The child's laughter carried through the double-paned glass, a sound that had become precious beyond measure in their carefully constructed world. The medical wing had been completely renovated following the security breach, with upgraded systems that rivaled any children's hospital in the city. But more importantly, Isabella's health had stabilized under Nora's constant care. The respiratory issues that had once threatened her life were now managed with precision protocols that allowed her to live as normally as any 6-year-old in their extraordinary circumstances. The transformation in their family dynamic had been gradual but profound. Viktor had evolved from the intimidating crime boss who once commanded through fear into someone who sought Nora's counsel on matters ranging from Isabella's education to business decisions that might affect their daughter's future. The walls he'd built around his heart had been systematically dismantled by daily doses of sign language lessons, bedtime stories, and medical consultations that became conversations about parenting. Dr. Campbell, Isabella signed from the garden, using the title that had emerged naturally as their relationship deepened. Can we build a snow hospital for my bears? The request was typical Isabella. Creative, medically minded, and delivered with the kind of joy that reminded Nora why she'd chosen pediatric nursing in the first place. The child's deaf education had expanded to include 3 sign languages, and her intellectual curiosity about medical procedures had blossomed under Nora's patient explanations. We'll need surgical instruments for the bears, Nora signed back through the window, and maybe some tiny nebulizers. Isabella's delighted giggle was accompanied by enthusiastic nodding before she returned to her snow construction project. The scene was domestic in ways that Nora had never expected to experience, especially not in the context of an armed fortress managed by one of the city's most feared criminal organizations. The security changes following the Kozlov incident had been comprehensive but invisible to casual observation. Viktor's organization had eliminated the rival family completely, ensuring that Isabella would never again face threats from that particular source. But more importantly, the attack had revealed vulnerabilities in their protective protocols that were now addressed with military precision. Dr. Kozlowski appeared in the doorway of Nora's office, carrying Isabella's latest test results and wearing the expression of someone who had watched a medical miracle unfold over months of careful treatment. Her lung function has improved beyond my most optimistic predictions, he reported, settling into the consultation chair that had become a fixture of their weekly meetings. The bronchial dysplasia is completely managed, and her immune system has strengthened significantly. Whatever you're doing, it's working remarkably well. Nora accepted the compliment with the professional satisfaction of someone who had found their calling in unexpected circumstances. Isabella's medical improvement was more than just successful treatment. It represented the kind of comprehensive care that money couldn't buy, but love could provide. She's thriving because she feels secure, Nora explained, reviewing the test results that confirmed her observations. The combination of medical stability and emotional support has allowed her body to heal in ways that weren't possible when she was constantly stressed about her father's safety or her own place in his world. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Viktor's arrival before he appeared in the doorway. His afternoon routine now included checking on Isabella's medical status, reviewing security protocols, and having conversations with Nora that had evolved far beyond their original professional boundaries. "How is our patient today?" he asked, moving to the window where he could observe Isabella's snow construction project. His voice carried the warmth that had replaced the cold authority of their early interactions. Strong, healthy, and planning to establish a medical practice for stuffed animals, Nora replied, noting how Viktor's entire posture relaxed when he could see his daughter safe and happy. Their relationship had shifted gradually from employer and employee to something that resembled partnership in ways that surprised them both. Viktor sought Nora's opinion on decisions that affected Isabella's future, and Nora found herself considering the family's long-term well-being in ways that went far beyond medical care. "I've been thinking about Isabella's education," Viktor said, settling into the third chair that had been added to accommodate their frequent three-way conversations. "She needs interaction with other children, but the security requirements make traditional schooling complicated." The discussion that followed illustrated how completely their dynamic had evolved. Viktor presented the challenges of his world honestly. Nora offered medical and developmental perspectives, and together they worked toward solutions that prioritized Isabella's needs while acknowledging the realities of their situation. "What if we created a small school here?" Nora suggested. 3 or 4 children from families with similar security needs, specialized teachers who understand the deaf community, and medical support integrated into the daily routine. Viktor's smile was genuine and unguarded, the expression of a man who had learned to trust someone else's judgment completely. "You're thinking like a mother," he said. And the observation carried weight that made Nora's chest tighten with recognition. Because that's what she had become. Somewhere between midnight emergency treatments and afternoon sign language lessons. Not Isabella's nurse, not Viktor's employee, but the maternal figure in a family that had formed itself around love, loyalty, and the shared commitment to protecting someone precious. The conversation was interrupted by Isabella bursting through the French doors that connected the medical wing to the gardens, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Snow clung to her expensive winter coat, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that transformed her delicate features into something luminous. "The Bear Hospital is ready for inspection," she signed dramatically, clearly having absorbed some of her father's flair for presentation. What followed was a solemn tour of the Snow Medical Facility, complete with detailed explanations of each bear patient's condition and treatment plan. Viktor participated with the kind of engaged seriousness that would have surprised his business associates, while Nora provided medical consultation with appropriate gravity. As afternoon faded into evening, the 3 of them returned to the warmth of the medical wing where Isabella settled into her favorite chair for her daily nebulizer treatment. The routine had become a family ritual, with Viktor reading stories in Russian, while Nora monitored medical equipment, and Isabella added sign language commentary that kept them all entertained. "Papa," Isabella signed during a pause in the story, "are you going to marry Dr. Nora so she can officially be my mama?" The question hung in the air with the kind of innocent directness that only children possess. Viktor's reading voice faltered slightly, and Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks as the medical equipment suddenly required intense concentration. But Isabella's question had articulated something that had been growing between them for months. The recognition that their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper and more permanent. They had become a family in all the ways that mattered, bound together by love, loyalty, and the shared commitment to protecting Isabella's future. Viktor's response came in gentle sign language that included both Isabella and Nora in its scope. Some families are formed by choice rather than chance, and the strongest bonds are built through caring for each other every single day. Later that evening, after Isabella had been tucked into bed with her favorite medical teddy bear and her breathing monitor showed stable readings, Viktor and Nora found themselves alone in the quiet medical wing that had become their shared domain. "She's right, you know," Viktor said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that he showed only in these private moments. "About the family we've become. About what you mean to both of us." Nora understood that they had reached a moment that would define their future together. The homeless nurse who had found a shivering child in a playground had become the cornerstone of a family that existed outside conventional boundaries, but operated on principles of love that were universal. "Sometimes the most dangerous choice is the only one that leads to family," she replied, echoing words that Isabella had once signed about her papa's willingness to fight for the people he loved. As snow continued falling outside the windows of their medical sanctuary, Viktor Petrov and Nora Campbell stood together watching over the child who had brought them together and created something beautiful from the intersection of desperation and hope. Their love story had been written in medical charts and emergency protocols, but it would be remembered as proof that family could form anywhere when people chose to care for each other completely. Just as Nora's compassion turned a moment of desperation into a lifetime of purpose, every act of kindness has the power to change lives in ways we never expect. When we choose to help someone vulnerable, we don't just save them. we often find ourselves transformed in the process. If this story of found family and unexpected love touched your heart, there are many more incredible tales waiting for you on this channel. From mafia bosses who discover their humanity through the love of a child, to ordinary people whose extraordinary courage changes everything. Each story explores the power of compassion to create miracles. Hit that like button if Isabella and Nora's journey moved you, and don't forget to subscribe with notifications turned on, so you never miss these powerful stories of love conquering all obstacles. Share this video with someone who believes in the transformative power of choosing kindness, even when it seems dangerous. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever had a moment where helping someone else ended up changing your own life forever? Your story might inspire our next video. Because sometimes, the most dangerous choice really is the only one that leads to family.